This is the Ultimate Landscape CEO podcast. Our guest is, ready for it? Bryan Stolz, CEO, Winterberry. Winterberry is an old peer group client of mine. When I first started my peer groups, must be close to 15 years ago. And if you listening don't know about the Leaders Edge peer groups that we run, please go to my website, jeffreyscott.biz. You can learn more. This company is 35 years old. They'll do about 33 million this year, I believe, roughly 240 employees, 2 locations, a big mix of maintenance, irrigation, landscape, golf course, 3 owners, Scott, Alan, Chris. We're talking to the GM today, who, when I met him, he was just a designer at the company, and he has steered the growth of the company, tripled the business, maybe quadrupled since he's been in the seat. And we speak about the cowboy culture that this company really embodies, and many of their approaches, which are counter to what are commonly accepted beliefs. And so we'll talk about, for example, how they'll form positions around people's strengths instead of forcing a round peg into a square hole. We will talk about the fuzzy org chart they use that fosters collaboration and team spirit and gets rid of the silos. We also talk about what you can do if you're not an owner. At the end, we talk about what you can do to really position yourself for that next promotion. Bryan talks about how he did that. So you're going to learn quite a bit about how they've grown their business and changes they've made. We'll talk about some mistakes that Bryan has made as a new leader. And we'll talk about his personal journey as well. And so really, there's something here for owners and for general managers, etc. Take a listen. Welcome, Bryan, to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jeffrey.
Man, it's been a long time, huh?
Sure has, yeah.
Introduce yourself to the audience and your company and give a few stats, employees, revenue, etc.
Sure. My name is Bryan Stolz. I'm the CEO of Winterberry. We're a company out of Southington, Connecticut, which is just outside of Hartford. We are projected this year, we're on pace to do about 33.5 million, about 240 people on staff. And we're a very diversified company. So in addition to your traditional maintenance, we also do fertilization, irrigation service, landscape design build, landscape commercial bid build, and then we have a very large golf course irrigation installation department as well.
You guys are rock and rolling. We know you work in Connecticut, but do you travel a lot for the golf?
Yeah, our golf course irrigation crews, they work all over the country. Right now we have people in South Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New York. And then our other services, we've grown out of Connecticut into sort of southwestern Massachusetts, a little bit of New York. We actually have quite a bit of work up in upstate New York this year as well.
And so describe the ownership team, because you're the CEO, but not the owner.
That's right. Yeah, I started here about 17 years ago as an employee and am running the business as an employee. We have 3 owners who own the business. The company was started by 2 brothers back in the mid 80s, and then they added their third partner about 25 years ago. He came on board, bringing the irrigation with him, and the 3 of them have owned the business ever since.
So Scott was the CEO. He was Scott Levitt, right? That's his last name?
Yep.
And he was one of my original peer group members, for sure. I don't even know how many years ago that was, maybe 13, 14. And what do you remember what the size was back then?
Yeah, I don't remember all the way back then, but we had plateaued around 2005 at around $10 million in size. So we had been hovering in the sort of 9 to 11 range for a number of years. So it was probably right around that size when he was in the peer group.
Yeah, yeah. Well, then we kicked his butt. Uh, he is the quintessential cowboy entrepreneur. He's
Absolutely. I mean, he brings that real entrepreneurial spirit, and it's always been really interesting in our ownership group. We have two people with that sort of personality who are very entrepreneurial, a little chaotic at times. They see opportunities and they want to pursue it, and that's how they built the business. And then our third owner is a little more detail oriented, and so the three of them made a really good team through all those years growing the business, getting us to 10 million. And in the end, what they recognized is that their skill set and their passion was about that entrepreneurialness, building, not running, not operating. And so that was when myself and my leadership team, we started taking over the day-to-day management slowly. That was quite a process, but we were able to bring a different perspective than the entrepreneurial mindset.
I think his cowboy nature is probably what got you into your position, meaning you were just this young kid. I mean, you're still pretty young, but you were much younger. This was before you got your MBA, and you were a designer, right? A designer salesperson.
Yeah, I started in a dingy old shed as a junior garden designer with zero experience, and very few companies I think would have hired me even just for that role, let alone the role that I have now. And that's a big part of our culture still is giving people opportunities, giving them the chance, and trying to see if somebody has the skill set for the next role. It's not how they do in their current role. It's what skill set do they have that matches the next set of responsibilities, because I was a pretty mediocre designer. I'll be honest about that. I was not an artist. Pretty decent in sales, but not a great designer. And it just wasn't the skill set that I had. But they were able to see that I had the skill set for this next type of role, and I'm really grateful that they gave me the opportunity.
Why did they even hire you? Like when I remember meeting you, you're not the first guy I would think about in a sales role, or not even the second guy.
Yeah, in fact, I remember during an earlier peer group meeting, a couple of the other members met me and told Scott that they should let me go
Well,
because
he did.
I
He
didn't
let you.
fit that designer profile. I wasn't that type of personality. They just gave me a shot because I was passionate about it,
Yeah.
and I really wanted to succeed. And sometimes that's half the battle.
Well, you're lucky we recommended you get fired because he ultimately fired you from that position.
That's that's true. And then getting up into the next position, also, I really owe a lot to the peer group because I don't know if you remember this, but as sort of a tryout, I was brought to one of the peer group meetings and had to do the presentation. And I remember it was very touch and go on whether I was going to get that role. And at the peer group meeting, then a couple of the other members told Scott, "Hey, give him a shot." And so it was a big moment for me.
But that position wasn't CEO. That was what, just GM or?
We called it the Chief Matrix Officer, which was just a made up role. Really, what it was about is it was about bringing in more metrics into the business, bringing in more accountability and measurables, and helping people guide their success through, being able to get more visibility on their performance. And so a lot of it was what you would call today business process improvement, but that led from there to CFO to CEO. So it was
Yeah.
really the starting point.
Yeah, yeah. I think every company needs a process improvement person of some kind. Sometimes it's the GM built in.
Mhm.
Sometimes the owner brings it. Not often, but sometimes. Sometimes you have to hire that person as a separate position. I think that's, uh, yeah. So sometimes that's how it comes into play.
I completely agree. I mean, we actually just hired somebody new to come in and take that aspect of my role off my plate just last summer, and it was a game changer for us. And what I did is I recognized that I really liked coming up with the ideas and coming up with sort of the strategy and the systems, but wasn't great at executing in the red zone. Wasn't great at getting those last 20 yards done and dotting the I's and crossing the T's. So we brought somebody in who was really good at that. Zero industry experience, but he's done an amazing job of taking these ideas and helping us execute on them.
Hey, every second in command needs their own second in command.
This is true. And one
You
of
know,
the key things for him that I think's made him successful is we've given him zero direct reports too.
yeah,
When you talk about that role of process improvement, if they're getting bogged down day to day with managing their own processes and managing their own people, they're not going to be able to execute as well as if they have that time freed up.
It's interesting you bring this up. One of my longtime coaching clients, Barney Naylor, we helped bring in a general manager, kind of a CEO general manager like you. And in his first year, he immediately promoted someone into this process improvement role, but really more of a project, like the guy that would implement his ideas on a project basis. And the guy paid for himself, and they made more money in his first year. And I remember that was the first thing he wanted to do was like add more overhead, right? Which, for a small company, and they were smaller than 10 million, when they hired him, it's like, what? I just hired you and you want your own mini me? But it paid off in spades.
Totally. I mean, it was a big fight for us to take on too, this position that wasn't going to directly impact things. So it was a hard sell, even to our leadership team. Our leadership team is really engaged in the strategy. And I had to go to them a couple times to really explain what the vision was and how this could help. And now to an individual, they are all totally bought in and really excited about the work being done.
That is great. So I want to talk about the cowboy a little bit more. So Scott started the business, and then he brought his brother on, and then he brought Chris on for this triumvirate, which was very messy when he joined our peer group. Triumvirates, as you know, they're always shifting, and it's always very difficult. But I believe one of the big moves Scott made way back was buying that huge piece of land you're on. How many acres is that?
We have about 15 acres.
15. And you're right near ESPN headquarters, I think?
Right across the street. Yep.
Yeah. And I remember, I think you told me that when Scott bought that property, one of his competitors drove in and said, "You are nuts." The company was tiny back then. And what a great play that has been for him, huh?
Yeah, it was a real leap of faith. In fact, when they bought the property was a time when we were really struggling as a company. It was well before I joined up, but they were having a really difficult time, and the opportunity came up, and that's another big part of our culture and who we are, which definitely has trickled down from the Cowboys, where we say we are opportunistic. And opportunistic is a buzzword that we use a lot because it's about pursuing opportunities, also creating opportunities for people. And you can't do that if you don't take those leaps of faith. And that big property that they bought all those years ago, now we are bursting at the seams. We opened up our first satellite last year. And just this past spring, we had to do a major overhaul of the site to expand and build out more of the building. It's amazing, even though it's a big site, how quickly you can fill it.
Reminds me of that Dr. Seuss cartoon where the fish would grow, and no matter how big the fishbowl was.
That feels very similar to what we went through.
So when I first came, when I first met you guys, big garden center, very proud of it. And I think we've been through one or a couple garden center recessions since then. Is it on a chopping block? What's the fate of it?
We actually ended up closing the retail side in the last fall. So this is our first year running without that retail.
And how has that impacted? Plus, minus?
In the overall, it's definitely been a plus. That market had gotten really tight. We were competing with big box stores who we couldn't touch them on price. We had better quality, but we were finding fewer and fewer people were willing to pay that quality while also being a do-it-yourselfer type. Because really what we found is when we were first running the garden center, it was a great source of leads for the rest of the business. There's a lot of overlap between the clients who we were servicing on whether it was the installation or the maintenance side and the people who would come in and meet us through our plant quality. What we found over time, though, is that our services side started sort of migrating upstream. We went to higher income levels. We moved our price points up. And so we really became known as a premium brand for our services. And so that overlap, if you look at like a Venn diagram, those circles didn't overlap as much anymore. They started moving separately. And so we were no longer getting the additive value of the retail client then being upsold to services or installs. So that disconnect happened over a number of years. And it was something that we were looking really closely at. And in the end, the final sort of reason why we made the call was twofold. We ran out of room, as I said, and so we needed to make more space. So that sort of decision point was not just whether do we keep retail or not. The next best option from keeping retail, from closing down the retail side, was to have to open a new facility as well.
Mm.
So that made the decision a lot clearer. And the other issue is that our people who are in retail were becoming less and less happy. We had a lot of people who were asking to transfer out from the retail into other areas of the business, having to work weekends, working with the general public. It's not easy. And so once that started, then that really sort of made the decision for us. And one thing I am proud of is whenever we did decide to move out of the retail, then we were able to give opportunities for all of our people in other areas of the business. So everybody who worked in the retail side full time was given an offer elsewhere. And we had quite a few of them take us up on that. And now they're doing great. And we've been able to add some human capital and some more talent to some of our other areas that we are more aggressively growing.
A couple topics I want to cover here. One is how you work with this ownership team above you and this leadership team below you. How do you work with one? How do you work with the other? Do they integrate it all?
It is 100% about communication. If being that sort of conduit on the communication sometimes can be challenging. But myself and the ownership group, we have a weekly phone call. The three owners, they have varying degrees of involvement still in the business. And so depending on who it is, the owner who is most involved still, I talk to him twice a day. And we're just always bouncing ideas off each other. And he's very involved in some of the brainstorming for the day to day and problem solving. Those are areas that he wants to get really involved in. And then our leadership team, we communicate constantly. We have a set meeting schedule. That's we found that as we grew, informal communication became a little more difficult, and so we had to formalize that through a meeting schedule, which was new for us because, as you mentioned, we were raised and built by cowboys, and everything just happened on the fly. That was one of the things we had to change. So we have monthly meetings for financials, we have monthly meetings for operations, and we have weekly meetings on the leadership team just to see what each other is doing. And through that schedule, then we're able to keep those touch points going.
And so, when do you bring the two groups together? How does that work?
A couple times a year, then we do all get together for dinner or some sort of team building. Especially since our leadership team, for the most part, came up through the business. All of our vice presidents, who are the more operational side of the leadership team, have been in the business for, I think the newest one has been here 9 years. And so they all developed through the business. They all know the owners very well. So in addition to the professional relationship, there's a personal one. And so keeping those touch points is important to everybody.
Yeah. And so you do quarterly strategic planning together?
That's more on an annual basis where we pull everybody together. The quarterly is more about, we do quarterly meetings, and that's more about our leadership team sort of just communicating what's going on, what challenges they're having. So it's less strategic and more tactical, but it's still really valuable. And then we also try to make sure that there's that personal aspect to it.
Gotcha. Okay. So do you have an actual second in command that you're grooming in case something happens to you?
Not really. What we're looking at more is taking some of the things that I do and systematizing it. Having come up through the business, I've been here 18 years working with the Cowboys. I joke sometimes that it's like I was raised by wolves, and so I'm very comfortable with that chaos.
Yeah.
Too comfortable sometimes. And one of the things that I've learned and that has been difficult to learn is the need to systematize the things that I do as well and make it repeatable and make it something that I can hand off and ask for help on. And as we've grown, that's been part of my growth. So it's really about sort of taking some of the responsibilities that I have and documenting and laying it out in a way that somebody else can step in and take that over. And that's also great because it creates room for somebody else to grow, for somebody else to take on new things.
Right.
And that's been difficult, but I think successful.
Yeah. Are you using any kind of knowledge platform for that?
We're not. We are looking at them. So the corporate officer, that new member of the leadership team that I mentioned, that's part of what he's doing is he's bringing in some new systems and some new technology for us to really help us out on that. So we don't have anything formalized at the moment. It's very much more, it's just about getting the information out of people's heads. And then how we organize it, I think, is sort of secondary to the activity of getting somebody to sit down and document what they do.
Interesting. It's interesting for a company your size, and it still has that wolf or cowboy mentality. It's amazing how far you can get by organizing the chaos without eliminating it.
Yeah, it's such an important part of our culture. When we started really going through the professionalization of Winterberry, the organization of Winterberry, and we had a lot of pushback from some of the old timers about, you know, will they still like their jobs if they can't go out and make decisions? Will they feel empowered, or will they be boxed in by all of these different processes and procedures? And so that was a really important part of it for us, was making sure that we allowed space within our frameworks for people to still be creative, to still be entrepreneurial. And that has paid off really well. Our growth it's been pretty aggressive, especially over the last 6 years. We've tripled in size. And over that time, most of that growth has been dictated by our people and directed by our people. Somebody might be given an opportunity to try a new service line, and then they expand it threefold in a few years. And example is our seasonal color. We had never anticipated having seasonal color as an independent service. We always viewed it as just part of a maintenance contract. It was something that you could upsell and add on, but it wasn't a major driver for us. We had an individual, and she wanted to grow. She wanted to improve her career, and she wanted to do it in color. And so we gave her the shot, and now it's its own department.
How big in revenue?
Right now, this year they should do about 1.2.
Nice.
Isn't a lot, but it was like $250,000 5 years ago. So
listen, I think $1 million, although I say this every year in spite of inflation, but I think when a spinoff reaches $1 million, it's the real deal.
Yeah.
And conversely, if you think you have a division and it languishes under or far under $1 million, it's not the real deal.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, those hitting certain targets and certain scales, and then you can invest in it. You can bring in more people. There's a tipping point to that, right?
Yeah. Oh, no, for sure. So, got another question for you. While I'm thinking about it, I'm going to move on to another question. You have, oh yeah, now I remember the question. Are you set up with division managers, or is it more like sales manager and ops manager?
We are set up with our department heads, which are generally our vice presidents. So we have three main verticals: our landscape construction, our golf course irrigation, and then our services. And then we have a fourth vice president who is our sales leader. And so he floats between the different departments. But within those departments, those verticals, then there are sub-departments that it's broken down into. And depending on the size and scale, though, some of those have their own leads as well. The majority
of them. What? They have their own what?
They have their own leads. So a department head underneath the vice president.
So is this like a matrix org chart where the sales executive helps all the departments but doesn't direct the salespeople directly?
Correct. Yeah, there's this plays into that sort of loose framework culture, and we definitely have some dotted line relationships, which is inefficient from a communication standpoint, and it's less effective at holding people accountable, we've found. So those are the negatives. But again, those positives are that it does create more space for creativity and for people to be problem solvers.
It's funny when you mention that. I remember when Scott, the original cowboy, first got up in the peer group meeting to write out the org chart. We were blown away at how confusing it was. It was like one of those football charts that show the movement of the both sides and all the players. And it sounds like you still have a little bit of that going on at a much larger size.
We do. And actually what's funny is if you look at the time period between then and here, there was a period where that was a much more rigid org chart. I think we overcorrected from that Wild West matrix that we had for a while, and we really made it very rigid. And what we found is that having those rigid verticals created too much competition between them, and we weren't getting a lot of teamwork between the different departments.
Mm.
And so what we ended up doing is creating more positions that floated between them. That was purposeful over only the last 3 years. And those positions are individuals that are not tied to a single vertical. They float between them. They don't have the direct reports in any one area. But what they do is they create connective tissue between the different verticals. And that's done worlds for our culture in terms of cooperation, lead sharing in between departments, resource sharing. That's actually one of the big items that I credit to our more recent growth is the ability to share resources, to pivot. If an opportunity in one department, if we have a really strong opportunity in one area and then a slowdown in the other, it's much easier to shift those resources if there's already some lines of communication set up between them.
And so how do you bring about accountability for the bottom line?
We have 11 different P&Ls that we track down to gross margin, or contribution margin as we call it. And those are then roll up into the individual verticals, those 3 verticals. And so we are very financially minded. We train people at various levels on how do you influence a gross margin? What is a gross margin? And we have monthly financial meetings where we go over those with the different teams, with all 7 of those P&Ls. And that's a great way to share the financial information. In addition to that, on the more operational side, we've really leaned into that this year, where we're using more operational information on dashboards. We've always had KPI programs, but they were a little clunky. It was hard to get the information. It was hard to keep it timely. And so we're now using Microsoft BI actually to build out dashboards in there, which is a tool that we had for free. We just didn't know how to use it. And now that we do, then we're building our dashboards in there through teams they're shared. And these are all free softwares. It just takes the effort to build them out. And we're pushing that out. That's something that I anticipate being one of our biggest culture changers coming over the next 2 to 3 years, is people at all levels being able to see individualized dashboards on how they're performing and how they're influencing the success of the business.
That sounds great. I have a few clients using Microsoft BI. And just to tie back to this entrepreneurial culture you have, so by having these division heads and then department heads in the divisions, or vice versa, depending on how you label it, it sounds like that has allowed you to show people that they can move up, not be micromanaged, and take on their own responsibilities.
100%. That upward mobility is a big deal. In our market in Connecticut, it's really fragmented. There's not a lot of large players. And so the line I use when recruiting people is, in this industry, if you don't have your name on the side of the truck, then you don't have a career. We actually try to fight against that. And we give people opportunities to move up, to develop, to build a long-term career, to be managers and leaders if that's where their interest is and that's where their skills are.
So kind of the intrapreneur, right?
I like that.
Yeah. So you've got these intrapreneurs going. Excellent. So one thing that always caught my attention about you is you've done a great job of crafting roles to fit people, which is the converse of what you read, what you're supposed to do, build the org chart first and only hire people to fit in. But that rarely works. I mean, it never works that way perfectly, and it rarely works that way smoothly. And it sounds like, and while the opposite is very messy, cousin Sue, we're going to make a job for her, right? That doesn't work. But, doesn't work frequently or often. So tell us a bit about how you've really worked to understand the person and help them get productive without, I think, squeezing this round peg into a square hole.
Yeah, I mean, really what it boils down to is a pretty simple philosophy that we don't believe in taking a person and trying to identify their weaknesses and improve on those weaknesses. I think that in the end is a losing battle more often than not. People are oftentimes who they are. Not to say that people can't change and improve, but to try to take somebody and really change them is a very difficult proposition. Instead, what we do is we just look for people who are good people. Winterberry people, we call is what we always say. That's a Winterberry person. And we try to bring them in, we try to identify what they're good at, and then we tweak their position around those skills. Just the last week, I made an offer to a gentleman who had come in. He applied for one position. We interviewed him. We didn't think he was a great fit for that, but I sat down with the leadership team, a couple members of the leadership team. We said, kind of like this guy, and we instead crafted a new position, which he's now thinking on whether to come on board for that position. So it's nice where you have that flexibility, and to allow our people to have that flexibility. That's not an activity that has to happen at the leadership level. That happens at all levels because people are supported in knowing that they can look at, say, their admin and say, okay, well, you're really good at sales. We have a few admin who now are selling on the phone in their downtime because they're good at it and they aren't looking to be out on the road in full-time sales. But we were able to craft their position and take a few other things off their plate to allow the space for them to do that. It's been really.
I remember when you first came on as GM or whatever you want to call it, you would sit down with people that were struggling to some degree, and you might spend a half day or a full day with them in the whiteboard. So do you still do that, or have you sort of fleshed out all those issues? And if you do, share with the audience how that works.
Yeah, we do. I wish I could say we fleshed out all those issues, but I don't know that we ever will. And we call it job crafting. So we take an individual who maybe they're doing really well at just one part of their job and not great at another area, or somebody who seems like they're not particularly happy and there might be a mismatch of role and individual interest. And we sit down with them and we just list out the things that they do, the parts of and then we identify the areas that they're really good at and the areas that they're struggling. And that sounds very simple, but that can be a pretty challenging conversation for some people. For some people, it's easy. They're really introspective. They really are good at recognizing their own strengths and weaknesses, and they're good at being honest. But for a lot of people, then that's more difficult. And so it's a process. And what we try to do then is identify what the things that they're succeeding at have in common, and then what other tasks are in common with those and what we can bring on, and then other people who are strong at their weaknesses and how can we shift those over. We have one pretty senior level individual right now who is really great at about 75% of his job and really struggles and hates the other 25%. And so for him, it's going to be a little more difficult. It's going to be a multi-year process that we've mapped out with him and the steps that he has to take to train others in that 25% so that he can do the 75% that he loves 100% of the time. So we sat down with him. That was 3 or 4 meetings over the course of about a month and a half. And we have a loose plan, and we sit down periodically. We reevaluate it, and we hold him accountable to the training part and basically say, you can't make this transition unless you backfill for yourself.
Okay, I like that. And you recognize it'll take over a year is what you're saying.
In this case, yeah, it's pretty specialized knowledge that he has. And the 25% that he doesn't like is all things he has to get out of his head, kind of like what I'm struggling to do, and get it down and documented so others can repeat it.
You make things sound like they're just going smoothly and lovingly and perfectly. Any big mistakes you want to share with the audience here, the struggles you had to work through?
Oh, geez. We've been talking a lot about people. I've certainly made my mistakes on the people front, quite a few. And everything that we're talking about is born out of learning from mistakes. We were a much smaller company, and making the leap of growth involved a ton of mistakes. That's the best way to learn. We have a couple individuals that some are still here, some who we lost because we didn't do this process in a way that involved them. And that was one learning experience for me, was I kept too much behind the scenes. So I had all these plans for the business, for people, for departments, for growth here, for pulling back there, all these ideas and all these plans. And I was not doing a very good job of communicating it, either to the leadership team or to the people the next level down. And I would sit down with somebody at times when they were really unhappy, and they'd say, what's the future? And I talk about it, and they'd get really excited. And then they'd ask me, why have I never heard any of this before? And that was a big failure on my part, was that I didn't communicate those goals and those ideas to people and didn't involve them in the process. And there was a lot of, I would say, a little bit of hubris to that too, where I wasn't involving people enough to get their feedback, to find out where they thought that I was wrong. And it's still something that I work on, but just getting back to communication. If you communicate to people and you can be honest with them and say, this is a thought, I don't know if this is going to happen, but here's what I'm thinking. What do you think? That can be a really powerful conversation.
Okay, I like that. So not sharing enough what's in your head, even if it's half baked.
Yeah, I stole a line from one of my VPs, and he just gets up in front of the room when he's doing this brainstorming, and he says, I'll be honest with you, I don't know if this is going to work. I don't know if this is going to happen, but we're going to try it. And having those honest conversations is a big part of change management too, when you don't always have to be right. If you involve people in the process early, it takes some pressure off.
I like that. You don't have to be right if you involve them in the process early. The fuzzy front end, I like to call it.
That's good. I'm going to steal that phrase.
Okay, so that's a good mistake. Share another one with the audience here. What else have you stumbled on?
One that we're struggling under right now, which is, it's a little more macro financial, but I think I fell into a trap earlier in my career as a leader on the financial side, where it did not take advantage of those low interest rates for years. And so in this time when we could have been growing much more aggressively than we are, and we could have been acquiring assets at this low interest rate environment and pushing growth, we weren't. And I think that it was born out of an overabundance of caution. And so now, as a result, then our growth is as impressive as I think it's been, and as aggressive as it's been. I think that we could have even grown more if we had really put on the gas, put our foot on the gas during those last few years. Yeah. A lot of our growth has been through the last couple of years, when you're dealing with much higher interest rates, more constrained capital, more constrained labor market, more difficulty in finding trucks and equipment. And so I think back to those years of 18 and 19, when it would have been a whole lot easier to do the growth then, and we're doing it now. So I definitely kick myself for that. We could be larger. And I think the learning point from that is just to take that leap of faith. You talk about Scott being a cowboy, taking a leap of faith on the building. As much as that's baked into our DNA, I pivoted too far away from that, and we're trying to have that again now.
Okay. You could take this point you're raising and look at it from so many different angles. I think younger people, there's some people that have just only been in business since the last Great Recession. All they know is up. They think it only goes up. And how old are you?
39.
Yeah, so you're still young. That means you were like a teenager when I met you, almost. And so when you're young and you think, low interest rates, it'll always be that way. But the older you get, the more you realize, up and down, up and down, up and down. And therefore, take more advantage when things are relatively doing well. But it also means don't overextend. So how do you balance those two things out?
I think having a long-term strategy is helpful in that, and then having benchmarks and checkpoints along the way. We always try to plan in 3 and 5 year increments, as well as 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, right? And the 5 year is pretty fuzzy, but it's goals. And then you have your checkpoints every year. And if you have those checkpoints on various factors that assess the risk, whether that's a leverage ratio or whether it's total debt versus earnings, whatever metrics you choose, as long as you maintain that analysis and you keep your checkpoints and you don't get out over your skis on those, then I think that's the way to do it. If we had, I think, back in 2016, 2017, done a better job of forecasting where we wanted to be, then I think it would have been easier for us to take those risks. because then they were planned for risks, right? A risk that you're shooting from the hip on is very different than a risk that you see coming.
Yeah. When I coach entrepreneurs, and we take on a handful every year, all different size companies. You know, yes, I want to know their 1 year plans, and yes, I want to know their far away plans, but I love the 3 year plan, just like you've said, because it 1 year and 2 years easy to be incremental. 3 years really forces you into the future, but it's not so far away that you can't be concrete. So it's a nice middle step. I will say, however, when I work when I'm coaching, whether somebody gives me a 10-year goal or a 3 year goal, usually I can help them get there in half the time. So when someone gives me like their first set of 3 year metrics, I'm like, we can get there next year. So I think it does take some pushing to get there. And that's where having that 10-year goal or 5 year goal, as you call it, probably helps you, because that one you're probably a little more pie in the sky, and it probably stretches you as you lay down your 3 year tracks. Does that resonate with you, or what is it? Tell me your version.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. People talk about the big, hairy, audacious goal, right? You want to have your goals that you are banking on, and then you want to have something that is, I wouldn't say pie in the sky, but something that is, if everything hits right and if you can really, really go after it. And when we said do our budgeting, we say we try to make it aspirational, and we want it to be realistic, but we also want it to push people. So I 100% agree. Otherwise, people will sometimes manage to the budget. I was with a really great professional coach through. I'm a member of YPO, and I love that because you get perspectives from outside the industry, which is really valuable. And I met a coach through there who he was talking about how budgeting can be limiting because it just puts you inside a box. And then you manage to the box and you pursue the box, and it actually limits that outside the box thinking and creativity. And so you need a balance of the two. You need a balance of your budgeting and your planning, but you also need people who are focused on breaking your budget and breaking out of your plans. I think that's a really important aspect of it too, like you said.
So you still work day to day with Scott, is that right, or with Chris?
More with Chris.
Okay. And he's on the golf and irrigation side.
Yeah, he focuses on the golf. He's done an incredible job of building a brand that's recognized, and people seek us out for that work, and that's been his baby. You talk about a leap of faith. We were only doing one golf course a year as early as 7 or 8 years ago, and it was a very small part of what we do, and now it's our single largest department.
I work with a landscape and golf company. There's like almost two separate companies. And man, the golf company makes a lot of money. Is that the same for you guys?
It can. It is not easy to manage. Being in multiple states, moving from project to project, there's a lot of uncertainty when you go into these projects. And so managing that uncertainty is an important part of what we do. Making sure your estimating is right, making sure your management is right. It can go well, and that team is kicking butt right now, but it's challenging.
What division makes the most money?
Right now, I'd say golf and services are pretty close when you pull the services together. They are both growing. Golf has grown faster over the last 5 years, but our services departments have also been steadily growing. That's been more incremental straight line growth, whereas the golf growth has been faster, certainly, especially over the last 3 years. But the services is nice and consistent, and they're also doing a great job of growing themselves. It's very different growth though, which has been interesting to see from my perspective. Where on the golf and the construction side, then you can grow in chunks, and you can do it on a more minimal framework and with minimal processes, and you might lose some margins, you might take more losses, you might have some more misses. But it's about risk assessment, I think, on the overhead, because you can do the work with minimal overhead. It's just how risky are you going to allow that work to be? Whereas
Mm.
on the maintenance side, there's very much more having to lay your foundation before you move on to it. So it's two very different growth paths, two very different growth strategies that we've identified, and it creates sometimes a little bit of a culture clash between the
Mm.
construction and the service side that has to be managed. It has to have attention put to it to make sure everybody's rowing in the right direction.
Cowboys and caretakers.
It's perfect.
Yeah. So what's the future? Tell me what's on your 5-year plan. Where are you guys headed?
One of the big things that I'd really like to do as a business is become more regional. So right now we are starting to do that. As I said, we had opened our first satellite. We're looking into more opportunities to do that, more operational focused satellites. And the strategy that we're using for that is we are trying to open up some new sort of semi-local geographies, and we're doing that through some of our services that are fewer visits. So we're not going after mow clients in these new areas per se. We're going after seasonal color, irrigation service, fertilization. And that way we can still route them from the central office because it's only 6 visits instead of having to make 28 visits for mows. And then
Mm.
we call that the tip of the spear. And we're using those to open up these new areas to then acquire those mow clients, the more recurrent, the full maintenance, and then move in with the satellite. That's sort of the strategy that we're trying with our first satellite, and it's working well. And then because we are such a fragmented market, we have a lot of very small operators, a lot of people nearing retirement. So we are looking at some acquisitions, which we've made a few small ones. We have looked at a lot of them, and right now we haven't jumped on as many as I think we could have, but we're being cautious with that.
Okay. Uh, Final question. Any advice for somebody who's in your position now in a company, whether they're a designer or they're a manager or they're in a misfit position and they have aspirations or ambitions? What advice would you give?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, I think there were two things that really made it happen for me. The first thing was I went outside the company to seek to improve myself, and I did it on my own. I went out and I got my MBA. You mentioned that I got that on nights and weekends. I also started working with some coaches and some mentors that I had found who helped me learn how to build a career and how to improve myself, and that was really important. If you Especially when you're moving up through an organization that you're already a member of, there can be a tendency sometimes for all that information and knowledge to just become so insular that it's hard to come up with something new and you can't see your blind spots. And so getting that outside knowledge as you move up can be really valuable and make you valuable to the organization, which is in the end what's going to get you promoted. And when you're looking for that improvement, make sure that that improvement is focused on the next level. So when I was a designer, it wasn't about going out and becoming a better designer. It wasn't about going to design seminars. I wanted to move into management. So it was about learning about finance. It was about learning about metric and analysis, about strategy, about managing people. And so I was trying to learn the skills I needed for the next level. And then the other thing I did was I took on a couple of positions that were broad and they touched every part of the organization. I started working on technology and marketing, which for us, because we have all these different services, was fragmented at that time. Each vertical kind of managed their own. And so by stepping in and taking on this role that touched all the different verticals, I was able to learn about the different areas. I was able to also be helpful to them. And so that's the best way to earn trust in an organization is to show that you can be helpful and you're there to help them and make their lives easier. And I think those two things combined were really helpful to me in building a career.
I love it. Bryan, this has been excellent. Say hi to Scott, Al, and Chris for me.
I will.
Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jeffrey. This is great.